From its introduction in the 17th century, the institution of slavery had proven to be very profitable for planters in the South. Yet, in the aftermath of the Revolution, there are significant doubts over whether this institution would continue. Economically, the key crop cultivated using slavery, tobacco, was losing its profitability, in part because of the loss of British markets, which increasingly imported tobacco from other parts of the world. There are also ideological doubts. Planters like Thomas Jefferson recognized that there was a fundamental contradiction between the democratic and egalitarian values of the Revolution and the continued existence of slavery. The North, which had never been economically dependent upon slavery, began the process of gradual emancipation after the Revolution. Even in the South, a significant number of slaveholders decided to liberate the African Americans they held in bondage. These planters increasingly looked to less labor-intensive crops, like wheat or corn. For many Americans at this time, it seemed that slavery would simply fade away. The development of cotton as a staple crop, however, radically changed the picture. One of the keys to this change was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin. Previously, it had not been very profitable to grow this crop in the South because the process of removing the sticky seeds from the cotton bolls was too time-consuming, even using cheap slave labor. Whitney's device greatly simplified the process. At the same time, global demand for cotton boomed because of the growing British textile industry and, after the War of 1812, from American textile factories. Cotton, like tobacco, was a labor-intensive crop which tended to wear out the soil. But it differed in one key way. Tobacco was essentially a luxury item with a limited market. Cotton was the basis for cloth, which was a necessity with an almost infinite market. From 1820 to 1860, the worldwide demand for this crop grew about 5% annually. This trade also benefited the North. By the 1840s, cotton accounted for 60% of the country's export trade, and northern middlemen made substantial profits on the warehousing, insuring, and shipping of this commodity. This helped create capital, which fed northern industrial development. Northern textile mills benefited as well from the availability of cheap raw materials. Despite cotton's role in the national economy, it was clear that the regional economies were diverging. During the colonial era, the economies of all parts of the country were largely agricultural, although significantly greater commercial activity had been present in New England and the Middle States. Between 1820 and 1860, however, the North became increasingly urbanized, industrialized, and diverse. The South did not see similar trends, in part because the profits from cotton were so high that the planter elite that dominated this region saw no need to diversify. By the 1860s, only 10% of the nation's industrial workers were in the South, with factories primarily involved in the processing of raw agricultural products such as flour and corn milling. In the Upper South, manufacturing centered on tobacco products, and to some degree, textile mills. Yet, even with the close proximity to the world's largest supply of cotton, the South boasted only 7% of the country's textile factories. Even in agriculture, the South remained limited in its commitment to the market. While planters growing cotton using the slave system were intimately involved in commercial relations, most Southern farmers didn't engage very much in market relationships. Only about 1/4 of white families owned any slaves, and only about 1% owned 50 or more. In other words, the big commercial plantations were comparatively rare. Most Southern farmers owned their own land, usually less than 100 acres. They lived in simple cabins rather than mansions. They raised a few hogs and chickens to sell, and perhaps a bit of cotton. But for the most part, they were subsistence farmers, only peripherally involved with the market economy. A significant minority of white farmers weren't even that prosperous. Lacking land, they were forced to become renters. In other words, while we have an upper strata of Southern society which possessed a tremendous amount of economic and political power, most Southern farmers simply got along. The general lack of jobs in manufacturing and commerce also created some problems for ordinary Southerners. Without these types of jobs, it was difficult for poorer folk to accumulate sufficient capital to acquire their own farms and businesses. This economy, with its relative lack of jobs, also attracted few immigrants from overseas. The overwhelming majority of people coming to the United States at this time went to the North rather than the South, further swelling the North's rapidly growing population. There were some efforts to diversify the Southern economy. Some Southern leaders recognized that an over-reliance on a single crop was potentially dangerous and made the South dependent upon the North in many ways. Yet, efforts to change the economy were slow. Many planter elites saw no reason to invest in a more modern economy, and since they were the individuals who typically held political power in the South, it was difficult to get government to contribute. By and large, the people in power pushed for traditional Jeffersonian limited government with low taxation. Planters, for instance, saw little need to spend money on public education, since reading and writing were not skills really necessary to be a simple subsistence farmer. Illiteracy rates among free whites were the highest in the nation. Because of cotton, the slave system spread. As new land was opened up in the West, Southerners eagerly started up new plantations, bringing this institution with them. Some older Southern states, like Virginia, witnessed an overall decline in the use of slaves as they adopted less labor-intensive crops, but they still profited from the system by exporting their surplus population of African Americans held in bondage. The interstate traffic in slaves became particularly important after 1808, when the international slave trade was halted. Slaveholders in the South continued to face a number of ideological and social problems, which threatened the continuance of this system. Many recognized uneasily that there was a fundamental contradiction between this institution and the values stated in the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal. Many Southern planters also considered themselves to be good Christians, and again they saw that there was a contradiction between their faith and the institution of slavery. Finally, the fact that most white Southerners didn't actually own slaves and didn't benefit directly from this system created a potential problem. Would they continue to support this institution?